Saul of Tarsus to Paul, Christ to the Gentiles. And we're going to begin our studies by looking at the background, the early life of Saul. Where did he grow up? I mean, after the quiz last night, we'd all know that. How did he spend his youth, and what education did he receive? And the first thing that we note about the life of Saul and the point where he's brought into the world, it was not at all by chance. So it's not as if Saul just happened to be born. He grew up, got his education, became a Pharisee, and then God thought, well, I need someone. And so he had a look around and he saw Saul of Tarsus, and Christ was sent to convert Saul. That's not what happened at all. Saul, or Paul, was in the purpose of God long before his birth. And as we're going to see this morning, Paul was going to be brought up in a certain way that was going to prepare him for the work that God had for him. He was going to experience certain circumstances. He was going to be brought up in a certain culture, and he was going to be educated in a certain way. And all these things were preparing him for the work that was before him. And that's what that quote up there from Galatians chapter 1 and verse 15 is indicating to us. It says, "But when it pleased God who separated me from my mother's womb and called me by his grace." So Saul was brought into this world for a specific purpose. He was separated out for the job that God had for him. There was nothing random at all about his birth. And so the time came in the purpose of God that Saul was separated from his mother's womb, and he was brought into this world. Where was Saul born? Tarsus of Cilicia. That's right, Tarsus of Cilicia. It was the hometown of his parents. We can see there on the map the relationship between Tarsus and Jerusalem. And up on the screen there in Acts chapter 21 and verse 39, Paul said, "I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, and a citizen of no mean city." And where it says of no mean city, other translations say it was not an insignificant city. It was no ordinary city. It was an important city. So we just want to have a look at what was Tarsus like as a city. Well, the biggest factor that contributed to the importance of Tarsus was its geographical location. So first of all, what does the name Tarsus mean? Close. It's good. Good try. Sorry? A basket. It means a flat basket. Again, this was a good description for what the area was like. We can see on that map there, the yellow band at the top of that map, that's the Taurus mountain range. But in the area inside that Taurus mountain range, it was nice and flat. And the soil in that area was very fertile. It was excellent for producing crops. And it also stood, as you can see, on the Cnidus River. And you could actually take ships from the Mediterranean Sea right up the Cnidus River, and you could dock at Tarsus. And so all these trading ships would have come up and docked in Tarsus. And Tarsus, no doubt, would have charged some sort of levy for these ships to come up and do their business there. And the people of Tarsus also would have been able to sell their goods to all these people who came by ship. So there would have been a considerable amount of wealth amongst the inhabitants of Tarsus. And the people of Tarsus had, at some earlier stage, constructed a road through that Taurus mountain range. So it was the only way through that mountain range. They were called the Cilician Gates. They're still there today. It's probably a little bit wider today than what it was back in Paul's day. It was only wide enough to fit a horse and cart through in the days that Paul lived. But this road gave access, as you can see on the map, it gave access up into Asia Minor. So to areas like Ephesus and Colossae without the need for taking a boat. So Tarsus was very well situated to take advantage of the trade that passed through those Cilician gates. And I was going to make a little joke about how they set up a toll gantry, but you guys don't have tolls down there, so you wouldn't know what I was talking about. So we'll move on. So Tarsus at this stage, the stage where Paul lived there, had a population, sources vary, between 250 and 500,000 people. So a considerable amount of people. Today, that modern day area today called Mersin has about 350,000 people. And Tarsus was famous for its cultural excellence. So by the time of Saul, Tarsus had been largely Hellenized, so it had been heavily influenced by Greek culture. And Strabo, who was, among other things, he was a Greek historian, and he praises the cultural level of Tarsus. You know, it had all these famous philosophers, it had poets, it had linguists, and the school of Tarsus rivaled those famous schools in Athens and Alexandria. They had a library with over 200,000 books, including a huge collection of scientific works. Now, I don't think that Saul would have been educated in that university there at Tarsus, because as we're going to see, he would have, at the age when he would have attended university, he was more than likely in Jerusalem. And although Saul didn't receive an education here in Tarsus, living in that society did leave its mark on Saul. You might remember in Acts chapter 17, when Paul's preaching to those in Athens about the unknown God, and he quotes some of their own poets back to them. So it definitely left its mark on Saul. Now, Tarsus was also a free city. So this meant because you cooperated with the Romans, well, they removed their garrison out of your land, out of your region, because they trusted you, and you were allowed to govern your own affairs. And you might think, as I did, that this automatically made the inhabitants of that area Roman citizens. It wasn't the case, although there were a great number of people in Tarsus who did have Roman citizenship. And we just want to explore this idea of Roman citizenship for a while, because we know that Saul was a Roman citizen. And we might wonder how Saul, being a Jew, received his Roman citizenship. Now, being a Roman citizen, it came with many privileges, and Paul availed himself of some of these privileges throughout his ministry. So as we can see on the screen there, you had the right to a legal trial, you had the right to appeal the decisions of magistrates in the lower court. You couldn't be tortured, you couldn't be whipped. You could exchange the death sentences for voluntary exile unless you were guilty of treason, and you couldn't be sentenced to die by crucifixion. We know when Paul died, he was beheaded. He wasn't crucified. And so there were many benefits that came from being a Roman citizen. And as we say, we can probably think about over the ministry of Paul and how being a citizen of Rome helped him in certain circumstances. So how did Saul come to have Roman citizenship? Because as we said, just being born in Rome or a Roman province didn't make you a Roman citizen. It was the status of your parents that decided if you were a Roman citizen. So if your parents were Roman citizens, well, then you became a Roman citizen. So in the absence of any information, we might assume that Saul's Roman citizenship come from his parents. But the question remains, how did Saul's parents become Roman citizens? Well, there are a few different ways that non-Roman citizens could be granted citizenship. The emperor, or the ruler at that time, could just make an imperial decree. He could say you all have Roman citizenship. You could serve for 25 years in the army. You became a Roman citizen, or 26 years in the navy. And in some cases, we have an example of this in Acts, you could pay a large sum of money and you could become a Roman citizen. It's unlikely that Saul's father served in the army or the navy, because as we're going to have a look at soon, he was a Pharisee. And the Pharisees wouldn't tend not to get involved in that kind of service. But there were a number of opportunities in which Saul's ancestors could have been granted citizenship through an imperial decree. Now, during the time of Pompey, 67 BC, it's probably about 100 years before the death of Christ, Tarsus was made the capital over that Roman province of Cilicia. And when it was made capital, a number of its inhabitants received Roman citizenship. Over the years, Tarsus was favoured by a number of Roman emperors. Pompey, Caesar, Antony, Augustus, they all had favourable dealings with Tarsus. And any number of these rulers could have granted citizenship to its inhabitants. And one leading philosopher from Tarsus, who was a man by the name of Athenodorus, So he became the tutor of the first Roman emperor, Augustus, and he remained his tutor for a number of years. And in return for his service, Augustus heaped lots and lots of privileges on the inhabitants of Tarsus, which included Roman citizenship and also exemption from taxes. So more than likely, we are speculating here, but more than likely Saul's parents, or it could have even been his grandparents, could have been the recipient of the status of Roman citizen via an imperial decree by any number of those Roman rulers who looked quite favourably on that city of Tarsus. And as a result of Saul's parents having Roman citizenship, well, this status was passed on to Saul when he was born. Now, although Saul was a Roman citizen, and he did call upon it throughout his ministry, he realised that he had a far greater citizenship than whatever Rome could offer. The future Apostle Paul was going to write these following words to the ecclesia at Philippi. He says, "Brethren, join in following my example and note those who so walk, as you have us for a pattern, for our citizenship is in heaven." And we just note here how the apostle uses himself as an example for others to look to and follow. And we're going to explore this idea when we look at our last study, when we have a look at this idea of Paul as Christ to the Gentiles. But we're all encouraged to look to Paul, look to his way of life as an example of a citizen of heaven, and to pattern our own lives on his example that's been left for us. And as Paul was in his day, well, we're all citizens of various cities, various countries today. And as in Paul's day, in Roman times, these societies that we live in, they all have certain norms, certain things that society finds acceptable, and often without realising it, we can be influenced by the thinking, the values, and the philosophies of society around us. And it's very easy for us and for our children to become products of the environment, the society that we live in. We become to think like the society because we're surrounded by it every day. And if we don't conform to the society that we live in, well, then society's very quick and very good at shaming, mocking, or pressurising us to fit in. So let's look to the example that the Apostle Paul leaves us. And as he tells us, follow his example. Follow his example despite the difficulties that we might face. We need to make sure that we're aligning ourselves with Paul and with Christ and not with the society in which we live. And if the things in our society don't conform with the examples that have been left on record for us, then we can't entertain them in our lives. We need to instead live our lives, make choices and decisions that are going to bring us closer to our God, remembering we're not citizens of this world. We have a higher calling. We have a heavenly calling. As Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 6, he says, "He has raised us up together and made us sit together in heavenly places in Christ Jesus." At our baptisms, when we take on the saving name of our Lord Jesus Christ, we're symbolically lifted up to sit together with Christ. And because of this, we're encouraging Colossians chapter 3, he says, "Seek those things that are above. Set your affections on things above and not on things of the earth." So we've had a look at the way in which Saul's parents or grandparents most likely received their Roman citizenship through some kind of imperial decree. But there are a few indications that also show us that Saul's family was quite a wealthy family. In the time of Emperor Augustus, so about 15 years before Saul was born, there was a number of issues with the governing body of Tarsus. It's described in the history books as becoming a degenerate democracy. And Emperor Augustus, he sent his Tarsinian tutor, the man we mentioned before, Athenodorus, he sent him back there to sort the issue out. And he did this by remodelling the constitution of the city. And what he did, he went there and he struck off lots of Roman citizens from that area. He made them leave the area. And by the time he finished, it was only people of significant wealth and standing that were left in the area of Tarsus who had Roman citizenship. And so it would appear that Saul's family was among the wealthy and the respected of the city because they retained their Roman citizenship. Now, where did Saul's family's wealth and his standing come from? One of the most important parts of a Jewish boy's life was his education, and it was good for them to learn a trade. So there are a number of rabbinical comments on this very thing in the Talmud. The Talmud is the Jewish commentary or the Jewish interpretation of the law of Moses. And one rabbi writes, Rabbi Judah, he says, "He that teacheth not his son a trade doth the same as he taught him to be a thief." And a second quote there was from Rabban Gamaliel, the one who taught Saul. And we'll see shortly why Gamaliel is referred to as Rabban and not Rabbi. But he writes, "He that hath a trade in his hand is like a vineyard that is fenced." So teaching your son a trade was of utmost importance to a Jewish father. And we know Saul's trade was that of a tent maker. So it's reasonable to suggest that Saul's father was also a tent maker. And Saul's father most likely learnt this trade as a result of the situation of Tarsus. So Cilicia was noted for its boundless quantities of goats. And those goats were kept up in those Taurus mountains that surrounded Tarsus. And these goats, as you can see from the photo there, they had long black hair. They were both durable and waterproof. And hair from these goats were made to use tents, ropes, clothing, bags, among other things. And these products that were manufactured in Tarsus, they were famous all over the world. So Roman tents, so the Romans' army's tents, they were made here in Tarsus. And because they were a trading city with ship access and access through those Taurus mountains up into the area of Asia Minor, the residents of Tarsus would have built up a great deal of wealth trading their wares and their goods. So this was most likely how the family of Saul built up their wealth and their standing in Tarsus. And we know that this trade that Saul was taught, it served him well during his lifetime. Later on in his travels, Paul used his tent-making skills to his advantage. It sustained him in his mission amongst the Gentiles, and it provided him an income. So he wasn't a burden to those in the communities that he was visiting. So up until this point, we have been speculating a little bit about the family of Saul, how they got their Roman citizenship, their status in society, how they built up their status. But now we come to a part that we can be certain of. So Saul says of himself in Acts 23, verse 6, he says, "Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee." So Saul's father was a Pharisee. And we just want to spend a little time thinking about who the Pharisees were and where they came from. Because whenever we think of the Pharisees, there's always a negative connotation involved with them. But they weren't always this way. So where did the Pharisees come from? Well, this is a timeline of the 400 silent years between the close of the Old Testament and the opening of the New Testament. Those lines, they're not all to scale, so don't worry about that. But we can see that a fair amount of history has passed between the close of the Old Testament and the opening of the New Testament. So the Old Testament closes with the Medes and the Persians ruling, and then we pass through the Grecian Empire, the wars between the king of the north and the king of the south, so the Ptolemaic, the Seleucid empires, and then we come to the Roman Empire when the New Testament opens. So that's why the scene in the New Testament is just so different to the close where we left off in the Old Testament. And the Pharisees developed out of this period of time between the two testaments. So during the rule of the Medes and the Persians, the way they dealt with their subjects, it was sort of more of a hands-off approach. You can live how you want to live, worship who you want to worship, just pay your taxes and don't rebel, and everything will be fine. But that all changed when the Greeks took over. So Alexander, he saw Greek culture as superior, and it needed to be spread and pushed onto all its subjects. So he demanded that Greek culture be the new way of doing things. So you speak the Greek language, observe Greek customs, and you had to integrate Greek life, or Greek ways, into public life. So the Jews could still practice their Jewish religion, but they had to do it with a Greek flavour. And so Greek culture was forced upon its people. And there were those Jews who were not happy about having Greek culture forced upon their religious observances. And so out of this period of time, there developed a group of people called the Hasidim. And the Hasidim slowly morphed into the Pharisees over time. And these people, these Hasidim, they resisted the pressures to change their religion to suit the culture around them. As we saw last night, the word Pharisee means a pious or a separate one. So they refused to worship the false gods of the empire that ruled over them. They wanted to remain separate from that. So we saw how Alexander, he wanted to force Greek culture onto everyone. Later on, the period of the Seleucid Empire, they tried to do the same thing. And the Hasidim, or the Pharisees, they resisted this. So they wanted to retain traditional Jewish religion. They continued to keep the law of Moses in its purity as they saw it. So we can see that the Pharisees, they started off with really positive motives, really positive intentions. But through the passage of time, they moved further and further away from these principles that they were founded on. And they became corrupt, as we see in the days of Christ. So Saul was brought up by his father, who was a Pharisee. And so what would life have been like for Saul as a youngster? We could imagine Saul's upbringing would have been quite strict. Now, one of the most important things in a Jewish boy's life is his education. And we can be quite certain that the early tuition of Saul was carried out in accordance with the provisions of the Mosaic law. So we have a quote there from the screen, we all know well. You shall teach them diligently unto thy children. Thou shalt talk about them when thou sittest in thy house, when thou walkest in the way, when thou liest down, when thou risest up. So in every faithful Jewish house, the boy sort of began his real Bible study when he was 5. And the first thing they began their training in was in the Torah, so the first 5 books written by Moses. And it was deemed that they were starting to make a bit of progress when they were able to recite the Torah by heart. It sort of makes me feel a little bit inadequate when I compare how much the Bible I can quote by heart. But no doubt there would have been a Jewish school in Tarsus where Saul's training would have been supplemented by tuition. So by the age of 10, Saul would have been studying various aspects of the law. And the rabbis in the school that Saul attended, they would have quickly picked up on how gifted Saul was. And they would have no doubt encouraged his parents to develop his education further than what they could have by sending him to Jerusalem. And there's a really important lesson in this for us today. Now, these early years of his home and his school life, they had a really important influence on Saul. It gave him great familiarity with the Hebrew scriptures. And it's important for us who have young children, and even if we have grandkids, it's never too early to try and flood our children's minds with things associated with the Word of God. You know, brainwashing is often used in a negative context, but we need to brainwash our kids. We need to be consistently reading the Word of God with them. So just some examples. Read your kids' stories before they go to bed. The CFF's put out these CDs with the lessons, and we just played them in our car. Whenever the car was on, these lessons played. And I was actually asking one of my sons a Sunday school question, and he just recited this whole slab straight from those CDs. It was amazing. Sometimes it doesn't go according to plan. We were listening to the lessons on Elijah and Mount Carmel, and just was listening driving in the car. I know this faint chanting in the background. I was listening. One of the kids was chanting, "Oh, Baal, hear us." So it doesn't always go according to plan, but it is just amazing how much young minds are able to absorb. And we need to make sure as parents and grandparents that we're creating an environment where we're putting the right things into the heads of our kids. Now, we looked at earlier how Saul was more than likely from a wealthy household. And if this was the case, then he would have had an educated, trustworthy slave called, we'll pronounce it how it's spelled, a pedagogos. And this slave was charged with the duty of supervising his life and the morals of the young boys in which they, of people who belonged to the better class. So they were authorised to train up a child, they were authorised to administer discipline and chastisement and instruction. And the boys weren't able to leave the house without this pedagogos going with them. And this slave would accompany the young Saul to school and would supervise him during all his lessons. So if he's falling asleep in one of his lessons, like Max up the back there, pedagogos would come and slap him and wake him up. That didn't work, he's still asleep. Saul took this picture from his everyday life and he applied it to his teaching. Come with me over to Galatians chapter 3. So Galatians chapter 3, verse 22. But the scripture hath concluded all under sin, that the promise by faith in Jesus Christ might be given to them that believe. But before faith came, we were kept under the law, shut up unto the faith which should afterwards be revealed. Wherefore the law was our schoolmaster, to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. But after that faith is come, we are no longer under a schoolmaster. So that word for schoolmaster there used to describe the law is the word pedagogue or pedagogos. So Paul used this experience that he experienced as a child, as he grew up, and he used it to describe the law and its relationship to faith. Well, a Jewish boy reaches a real milestone in their life when they turn 13. So when a Jewish boy turns 13, they become they become a bar mitzvah, which means a son of the commandment. So under Jewish law, children, they're not obligated to keep all the commandments, although they're encouraged to do so if they're under 13. But when a boy turns 13, he now becomes obligated to observe the commandments. And they have a bar mitzvah ceremony, which formally and publicly marks the beginning of that obligation. We can see a few pictures there on the screen of a modern day ceremony. I think it probably would have been a little bit different in the ceremony that Saul undertook. I don't think Saul's family would have been into the disco lights. But we made a note that before the age of 13, Jewish boys were not obligated to observe the commandments. But I don't think this might have applied to the household of Saul. Because in Acts chapter 26, in verse 4 and 5, we read this. It says, they have known for a long time, I've just got the NIV translation I'm reading from, they have known from a long time, if they are willing to testify it, that according to the strictest party of our religion, I lived a Pharisee. So Saul's father wasn't just an average Pharisee. So his father belonged to a class of Pharisee that was most precise and rigorous in interpreting the law of Moses and observing even the more minute precepts of it. Not the law, not just the law, but also the oral traditions of the law. So what are the oral traditions of the law of Moses? Just reading from the screen there, it says the oral law is a legal commentary on the Torah. It's a legal commentary on the first 5 books of the Bible, explaining how its commandments are to be carried out. Common sense suggests that some sort of oral tradition was always needed to accompany the written law, because the Torah alone, even with its 613 commandments, is an insufficient guide to Jewish life. So according to the ancient rabbis, the oral Torah, or these traditions, they were given to Moses along with the law of Moses. So Moses was up in the Mount Sinai, he was given the law of Moses, but then he was also given an explanation of how you are to keep these commandments. And that's what they refer to as the oral traditions. And Moses didn't write these oral traditions down, he just passed them on verbally to his successor. So he passed them on to Joshua, who then would have passed it down till today, they believe. And this may be true, but the oral traditions were then believed to have been passed down from generation to generation, and further interpretations by other rabbis were also added in to these. down through the ages. And all of these, it actually included different interpretations to previous ones that they had. And these oral traditions weren't written down, they were just memorized. And all these accumulated traditions of the oral law, expounded by scholars in each generation from Moses down through the ages, is considered a necessary basis for the interpretation and the reading of the law of Moses. And there's a few different words that we need to remember when we're speaking about these oral traditions. So you've probably heard of the Mishnah. The Mishnah was actually the written record of these oral traditions. So these were written down after AD 70. The Jews were worried that they were going to lose all these oral traditions, so they sat down and they wrote all these traditions out. So that's the Mishnah. Then you had the Gemara, which was commentaries on the Mishnah. The Halakha, which is a detailed legal discussion based on the Mishnah. And the Talmud is just, they put all these things in together, and that's the overarching document, the Talmud. So when we're talking about the Talmud, when we're talking about these oral traditions, we're not just speaking about a book, we're speaking about libraries of books. And on the screen there, we have some extracts from a commentary on a section of the Talmud. So this is called the morning ritual in the Talmud. And it goes through what a faithful Jew had to do the first thing in the morning. So the paragraph starts, it says, "I'll now turn to a brief review of the Talmudic morning ritual." So when a person awakens, he goes off and he quotes that blessing. On hearing the sound of a rooster, he'd quote another blessing. And then you see down that blue box down the bottom, on opening his eyes, another blessing. On straightening up, another blessing. And these 15 blessings of this morning ritual were just the first of 100 blessings that a Jew's required to recite each day, according to the Talmud. And then, of course, you come to all the intricacies of washing, what sort of water they were to use when they were washing, where did the water come from, what was the correct order of washing, how much water were you to use. It goes on. And the family of Saul would have been scrupulous in following all these aspects of these oral traditions. And as we suggested earlier, Saul would have been singled out by his teachers in Tarsus as a promising young person. And his father wanted him to become a rabbi and to occupy one of the most honourable positions that a Jew could attain. And so after his early years at Tarsus, he was sent up to Jerusalem to further his education. So how old was he when he went up to Jerusalem? He would have been quite young. He says in Acts 22 verse 2 that he was brought up in this city, so he was brought up in Jerusalem. So perhaps make the suggestion he was around 12 or 13 when he made the journey to Jerusalem. There's some remarkable parallels between Paul and our Lord Jesus Christ, which we'll explore a little bit later on. We know that Jesus first made his appearance in the temple when he was 12. And it was at the age of 13 that we saw Jewish boys became bar mitzvah. So it suggests that perhaps Saul was around 12 or 13 when he made the move up to Jerusalem. And while he was at Jerusalem, he was educated at the feet of Gamaliel. And the Jews record Gamaliel as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, rabbinical teacher of the first century. Just come with me over to Acts chapter 5. We'll read a little bit about Gamaliel. So in this chapter, we have Peter and some of the apostles, they're preaching before the council. And what they say, it stirs the council up so much that they want to put the apostles to death. And we read this in verse 34 of Acts 5. Then stood there up one in the council, a Pharisee named Gamaliel, a doctor of the law, had in reputation among all the people, and he commanded to put the apostles forth a little space. See, Gamaliel commanded. He was a great man. He's a great teacher, and he was well respected by the Sanhedrin. And in verses 38 to 40, Gamaliel says something. And at the end of those verses, verse 40, it says, to Gamaliel, they all agreed. So this was the man that Paul studied under, one of the greatest, the most well-respected leaders of the law in the land at that time. And he had the honoured title of Rabban. Now, Rabban means our teacher, so it's a plural word, the teacher of many, whereas a rabbi just means my teacher, in the singular. And it's interesting because remember when in John chapter 20, Jesus shows himself to Mary after he had been raised, and Mary calls him Rabboni. So that's the same word, Rabban. And so we can see that in the use of this word, when Mary calls him Rabboni, Mary has identified Jesus as the greatest teacher in the nation. And as we mentioned last night, there were two big colleges of the rabbinical schools, and very few boys got into these two schools. You need to have a lot of money to send your kids to Jerusalem, to these schools, which is another indication of the wealth of Saul's family. The two schools were Hillel and Shammai. The difference between these two schools, Hillel upheld the traditions as being superior to the law. So all these oral traditions, if they contradicted the law of Moses, well, Hillel said, we'll go with the traditions. But the other school, Shammai, they despised the traditionalists when they conflicted with the law of Moses. They stuck with the law. And the school of Hillel was far more influential than the school of Shammai. And Gamaliel was actually the grandson of the founder of the school of Hillel. He was the grandson of Hillel. And history suggests that only 500 students were ever taught by Gamaliel. So Saul was one of 500 educated by Gamaliel. And Saul says that he was brought up at the feet of Gamaliel. Now in Jewish synagogues, the teacher sat on a raised platform, sitting on the table up here. And this tradition, and the students sat on the floor in front of the teacher. Tradition come from Deuteronomy 33 and verse 3, in reference there to Moses and the children of Israel. And in the synagogues, the students sat in an arrangement that reflected their academic position. So we have a description of a typical academic synagogue setting where Saul would have studied. It said the academy head presided seated on a chair or on special mats. So in the front rows, so where Cameron's sitting, sat the important scholars, including his colleagues or outstanding pupils. And behind them, all the other scholars. And a little bit further down, when the academies grew larger, particularly in Palestine, the order of the seating was based on a precisely defined hierarchy. In the first row sat the great scholars, the second row, less important sages, and so on. So we can see Saul, a young man, seated front and centre, right at the very feet of the renowned and the revered Gamaliel, suggesting that he was an outstanding student. One of the greatest characteristics of Saul was his zeal. He was extremely zealous. He had a zeal that could be challenged by no one. And Saul's academic accomplishments exceeded many of his peers. He was extremely intelligent and he had a brilliant mind. He wrote this in Galatians chapter 1, verse 14. He said, I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in mine own nation, being more exceeding zealous for the traditions of my fathers. And had God not intervened in the life of Saul, no doubt Saul would have gone on to be the next great rabbinical leader like Gamaliel, like Hillel. And he was extremely zealous for the law, for his adherence to the law of Moses and its oral traditions. That's the way he'd been brought up. And so strict was Saul in his obedience of the law that he says this, he could say this in Philippians chapter 3, verse 6. As touching the righteousness which is in the law, he was blameless. So he says Saul didn't do anything by half measures. And the young man who emerged from his education at the school of Gamaliel was nothing short of fanatical in his desire to observe every aspect of the law perfectly, as perfectly as he saw it. And we're not told what Saul did after his period of education finished at Jerusalem. Did he return home to Tarsus? Did he take up a position in the synagogue there? Well, we're not told. But let's just take a step back and consider what we've looked at this morning. We want to have a look at the threefold influence on the life of Saul to this day, and how all these influences played a part in God's preparation for his future role. So first of all, we can see he's brought up in a Greek-speaking city with Greek culture, and so he was well placed, wasn't he, to become the apostle to the Gentiles. He was able to preach in all those Gentile cities, the majority of which would have spoken the Greek language. He could also speak Hebrew, He could preach to the Jews in Israel, also to Hebrew-speaking Jews that were dispersed throughout the land. And he was also educated by the best in the law and the oral traditions. He understood their argument better than anyone. And so when he converted to Christ, he knew their argument and he could go and argue against them. He was well equipped. And finally, he was a Roman citizen, which allowed him to travel anywhere in the Roman Empire and to preach the gospel. It allowed him to preach, as it says, the utmost part of the earth. And his Roman citizenship also offered him a certain amount of protection. It saved his life on occasion throughout his ministry. And so we can see that in the upbringing, in the early life of Saul, the hand of God was working. It was working in his life so that he was given the best possible training, the best possible upbringing for the work that God had before him, even though, as of yet, he had no idea. So we'll leave it there for this morning, and in our next class, we'll move on and have a look at the conversion of Saul. Thank you.